In the tense weeks after Pearl Harbor, the Pacific bristled with danger. On December 7, 1941, Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor severely damaged the U.S. Pacific Fleet, drawing America into a global war. Japanese forces swept through East Asia, conquering the Philippines, Singapore, and other territories. By spring 1942, their next target was Australia. If Port Moresby and New Guinea fell, Australia's sea lines of communication would be cut off. To block this, the United States and Australia dispatched 2 carrier task forces plus an Australian cruiser squadron. In early May, these fleets converged in the Coral Sea off northeast Australia for an unprecedented fight. But the ships never saw each other. Instead, planes were launched from carriers and over the horizon attacked enemy ships. As a Royal Australian Navy historian notes, this was the first major engagement in which surface vessels neither sighted each other nor exchanged a single shot, with all offenses carried out by aircraft. Hello, and welcome to Deadliest Disasters. It was the first battle fought purely by carriers. It took place just months after Pearl Harbor as the U.S. Navy was still recovering from defeat. By May of 1942, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had few capital ships left. Admiral Ernest King and Admiral Chester Nimitz desperately needed to stop the Japanese advance toward Australia. In early May, Japan launched Operation MO, seized Tulagi and the Solomon Islands, and then Port Moresby and New Guinea, thereby isolating Australia. Against this threat, 2 American task forces sailed north from Australia. Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher commanded the carrier groups from Lexington and Yorktown, while a cruiser force under Royal Australian Navy Rear Admiral John Crace guarded the flanks. On May 3rd through 4th, the Japanese occupied Tulagi and Des Moines. U.S. carrier planes responded with raids on Tulagi Harbor, sinking or damaging Japanese warships ashore. In this preliminary phase, neither side's carriers were within striking range of each other. Both began searching the sea by aircraft. Cruisers and destroyers zigzagged ahead of the carriers as protective screens. The strategic stakes were enormous. Japanese planners later explained they hoped to destroy the U.S. carrier fleet and force America to beg for peace. And U.S. commanders, reeling from earlier defeats, aimed only to check Japan's juggernaut, buying time to rebuild. By the morning of May 7th, the American carriers were northwest of Tulagi. Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zoikaku lurked to the east. Reconnaissance planes soon spotted the American tanker USS Neosho and her escort destroyer USS Sims far south of the action. Mistakenly identifying Neosho as a carrier, Japanese dive bombers attacked. The cruiser screen scattered and Sims took multiple hits and exploded, sinking almost immediately. The official Navy report stated that Sims sank with very heavy casualties. Only 15 crew survived in a lifeboat. The rest of Sims' roughly 200 sailors went down with the ship. The Neosho was also struck by bombs and a kamikaze-style crash. With flooding and fires aboard, Captain John Phillips ordered abandon ship. When the survivors later mustered on the rescue ships, Phillips counted 1 officer and 19 men dead and a staggering 4 officers and 154 men missing. In despair, Corpsman Henry Tucker, seeing so many wounded around him, swam between the rafts to tend to the burn victims. He carried nitric acid to treat severe burns and even organized loading the wounded onto lifeboats. Only later did comrades learn Tucker had declined rescue, saying he was of greater use where he was, but unfortunately, he was never seen again. His selfless heroism ended in presumed death among the injured. The horrors of dying at sea are evident here. Men with severe burns, slashes, and broken bones, trapped in oil-slick waters and in tiny boats for days. Medical reports noted that staff treated first and second degree burns, shrapnel wounds, contusions, and compound fractures as routine. Meanwhile, late morning on May 7th, the Americans found the Japanese covering force, including the light carrier Shoho. planes from Lexington and Yorktown pounced. In 25 minutes, the pilots unleashed a devastating assault. Multiple torpedo hits and bomb strikes enveloped Shoho. Fires erupted instantly. By noon, she sank by the bow. Among her crew of around 760, 631 men died. Only 131 were picked up from the water, an appalling loss. Shoho's destruction was a rare bright spot for the Allies. It was the first time the Japanese had been beaten in an engagement, according to contemporary reports. Late that day, Japanese air attacks fell on Crace's cruiser group covering Jamard Passage, but caused little damage. Critically, however, Japanese scouts misreported having sighted battleships. Admiral Inoue halted the Port Moresby invasion force until he could verify this phantom threat. In reality, no battleships were there, just Crace's smaller ships, but the misperception spared the Allied flank. By the evening of May 7th, both sides were aware of carrier ships very nearby. The Japanese invasion ships at Port Moresby turned back, stalling the Moresby operation indefinitely. At dawn on May 8th, both carrier forces finally spotted each other some 300 kilometers apart. Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi and Rear Admiral Fletcher each launched massive strikes. Fletcher first sent 75 planes, while Takagi launched 69 airplanes toward the U.S. carriers. The Americans had a brief advantage. Both U.S. carriers carried new radar, giving more warning and time to arm their fighter screens. Nevertheless, both carriers were hit in quick succession. Yorktown took a bomb amidships and a near miss that opened seams in her hull. An oil slick trailed in her wake. Lexington, bigger and slower, fared worse. Around 11:30 a.m., she was struck by 2 bombs and 2 torpedoes in rapid order. Almost immediately after the initial torpedo hit, Lexington's crew began emergency damage control. But then a spark ignited the gasoline vapors leaking from the ship's damaged aviation tanks, according to the senior doctor aboard. This set off an immense explosion and further loss of life. The blast blew holes through Lexington's flight deck, sending up a towering mushroom cloud that engulfed the carrier's bow. Scalding fireballs, burning fuel, and flying shrapnel ripped through the decks. A medic watching the carnage later noted treating dozens of survivors with horrific injuries. First and second degree burns, shrapnel wounds, blast injuries, and even compound fractures. Survivors leapt into the oil-slick sea or clambered into life rafts. Frantic calls for help rose amid the smoke. Shipmates described seeing men burning alive on the flaming deck. Navy records count 216 Lexington sailors killed in the attack, and more than 170 were wounded. Among the fallen were the ship's senior dental officer, killed instantly by a shell, and pharmacist's mate Virgil Weeks, who with complete disregard for his own safety, helped evacuate casualties onto rafts until being struck by shrapnel. Only hours later, Lexington would be declared a total loss. As flames consumed the Lexington, Fletcher ordered the remaining crew off board. He turned his surviving ship southward and at 12:47 p.m. exclaimed, quote, "Fire's not out," unquote. By early afternoon, the Lexington's fires raged uncontrollably. Repeated detonations in the aft magazines tore the ship in two. Finally, at 5:07 p.m., all hands were ordered off and U.S. destroyers hit Lexington by torpedo to ensure she sank. The mighty flat top that had launched hundreds of American planes now slipped beneath the waves. Nearby, Yorktown remained afloat but mortally wounded. She could no longer fight effectively and limped toward Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, American strikes had their own impact. Shokaku was hit repeatedly by heavy bombs. Explosions tore open her flight deck fore and aft, killing or wounding 223 men on board. Shokaku, too damaged to recover her planes, was forced to withdraw. Suikaku escaped with only splinter damage, but many of her pilots and aircraft had been shot down. Only 46 of Suikaku's 69 planes returned. About a dozen were so badly crippled that they were dumped to sea. Takagi, believing he had sunk 2 U.S. carriers, turned north triumphantly, thinking the battle won. In the raw aftermath, both sides could claim partial victory. The Japanese had sunk a fleet carrier in exchange for their light carrier. From Tokyo's point of view, the exchange seemed favorable, and the Japanese press rejoiced at 2 fleet carriers down for just 1 light carrier. Vice Admiral Inoue later wrote that such a trade was a fair exchange. American public morale sagged at the loss. Lexington's demise was not greeted with happiness by Admiral King and Admiral Nimitz. Official reports tallied U.S. losses. In addition to Lexington's 216 killed, the oiler Neosho lost at least 20 men and many more were missing, and Sims lost almost her entire crew. Planes lost on both sides numbered in the dozens. Yet the larger impact favored the Allies. Port Moresby remained in Allied hands. The Japanese invasion force, spooked by false reports of American battleships and the appearance of burning Shoho, aborted its landing plans. As the Royal Australian Navy history observes, although Allied losses were greater, the invasion of Port Moresby had been stopped. Coral Sea had halted Japan's southern drive, giving Australia a reprieve. Moreover, Shokaku and Zoikaku would miss the crucial Battle of Midway just a month later, a decisive loss for Japan. As a war analyst commented, temporarily losing the services of these 2 carriers at Midway was probably much more important than permanently losing Lexington. In the end, Coral Sea was a grueling Allied strategic victory despite a tactical defeat. By delaying Port Moresby, it kept supply lines open and checked Japanese momentum. The carriers Lexington and Yorktown and many brave airmen paid a terrible price, but their sacrifice blunted a Japanese onslaught that had seemed unstoppable since Pearl Harbor. For dozens of young sailors and aviators, the sea became a tomb, burned, broken, and drowned. As one sailor's report notes, discipline held to the end. The gun crews fired until the ship sank, but the wreckage and oil-slicked waves carried haunting proof of the battle's horror. In the end, Coral Sea left an indelible mark. It saved Australia and set the stage for America's next victory at Midway, showing that even in defeat, there can be hope. Thank you all for tuning in. Please like and subscribe, and let me know what other topics you'd like me to cover. This has been Deadliest Disasters.